The forest was quiet, except for the sound of leaves crunching softly under the explorer's boots. The air was thick and damp, and the tall trees stood so close together that sunlight could barely touch the ground. A thin mist moved slowly between the trunks, making it feel like the whole place was holding its breath. The explorer had been walking for hours, guided by nothing but a hand-drawn map and a small compass that swung gently with every step. It wasn't the first time traveling through wild places, but this forest felt different. It was too still, almost like it was keeping a secret. The journey had started as a simple expedition. A local villager had told stories about strange metal shapes hidden deep in the woods. Most people thought it was just a local legend, the kind that keeps kids from wandering too far at night. But the explorer had heard many legends before that turned out to be more than just talk. Something in the way the villager spoke had sounded sincere, almost nervous. That was enough reason to follow the trail. The deeper the explorer walked into the forest, the less it looked like the kind of place people ever visited. The paths became harder to follow. The branches hung lower and vines wrapped around tree trunks like ropes. Even the birds seemed to avoid this part of the forest. There were no sounds of animals at all now, just the explorer's breathing and the occasional rustle of dry leaves. The compass needle trembled for a moment as if confused, then steadied again. The air grew cooler. A strange smell drifted through the mist. Not the scent of wet wood or moss, but something metallic, like rust and salt water. That was odd. The nearest coast was far away. How could there be a sea smell here? The explorer slowed down, scanning the area carefully. The ground beneath the boots changed too, turning from soft dirt to something more solid, like metal buried just under the soil. The explorer knelt down and brushed away a layer of dead leaves. There it was. Cold, rusted steel. It didn't belong in a forest. With a faster heartbeat, the explorer followed the line of the buried metal. It stretched out for several meters, before curving upward behind thick vines and branches. At first it was hard to understand what it was, but then, through the mist, a shape began to appear, tall, curved, and massive. The explorer stepped back a little, squinting to take it in. It wasn't just a piece of metal. It was a wall. No, not a wall. A hull. A ship's hull. The mist slowly lifted as the sun tried to push through the canopy. The shape became clearer and the explorer's eyes widened. There, right in the middle of the forest, stood the towering body of a cruise ship. It looked as though it had grown out of the ground itself, its white paint now faded and cracked, with vines crawling up its sides like long green fingers. The bow pointed toward the sky, tilted slightly, as if frozen mid-voyage. The deck rails were bent but still intact. Windows, once clear, were now stained and fogged over. A seagull cried in the distance, even though there was no sea anywhere near. The explorer stood still for several long minutes, staring in disbelief. How could a massive cruise ship end up here? There were no rivers big enough, no tracks, no roads. It looked impossible. It looked like a dream or a trap. The forest around the ship seemed even quieter now, as if everything living had stepped aside to make room for this giant intruder. The mist circled it like a soft blanket. The explorer walked closer, brushing aside thick leaves and stepping over old roots. As they approached the ship, the scale of it became overwhelming. It wasn't a small vessel that could be dragged here somehow. This was a full-sized cruise ship, the kind that once carried hundreds of passengers across oceans. The name on the side was too faded to read. The letters scratched and broken by time. Rust streaks ran down its surface like old tears. The ground near the base of the ship was covered with pieces of broken wood and metal. Some parts were sunk slightly into the earth, as if the forest had slowly swallowed it over the years. The explorer tilted their head upward. The ship's deck towered above like the wall of a tall building. It didn't seem real. As the explorer walked around the hull, they noticed details that made the scene even stranger. There were still ropes hanging from one side. A ladder of metal rungs was attached to the lower deck, rusted but still in place. A door sat slightly open a few meters above ground, its hinges squeaking softly in the breeze. And most unsettling of all, there were signs that someone, or something, might have been here long after the ship ran aground. Footprints, faint but visible in the soft earth. They were not fresh, but they were not decades old either. The explorer crouched down to look closer. The footprints led toward the side of the ship, disappearing into a dark gap between the hull and a fallen tree. A strange feeling settled in the pit of the explorer's stomach. It wasn't fear exactly, but a deep awareness that they were not just looking at a wreck. They were standing at the edge of a story that no one had finished telling. A gentle wind moved through the trees, rustling the leaves and making the vines on the ship sway. It was the first sound other than the explorer's footsteps in a long time. The metallic smell grew stronger, mixed now with something else, a faint scent of old fuel or oil. The explorer adjusted the strap of their backpack and glanced at the sky. It was getting darker, the mist thickening again. Exploring the inside at night would be reckless, but leaving without looking inside felt impossible. This was a discovery no one would believe without proof. Still, caution won. The explorer decided to make camp nearby and wait for morning. They found a dry patch of ground not far from the ship, surrounded by thick bushes that offered some cover. A small fire crackled softly as they set up a tent, its warm light cutting through the cold air. From where they sat, they could still see the outline of the massive ship through the trees. It looked like a sleeping giant, lost and forgotten by time. As the night grew deeper, the forest returned to its stillness. No birds sang, no insects hummed. The only sounds were the soft pops of the fire and the occasional creak from the ship as the wind brushed against its metal body. The explorer couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, not by a person but by the forest itself, as if the trees had seen this ship arrive and had never forgotten. They opened their journal and wrote down everything they had seen: the location, the ship's size, the footprints, the smell, the strange compass behavior. The handwriting trembled a little. Even with the fire burning beside them, a shiver ran down their spine. This discovery would change everything. But how would anyone believe it? The explorer closed the journal and leaned back, staring at the stars peeking through gaps in the leaves. Questions filled their mind. How long had the ship been here? How did it end up so far from the ocean? What happened to the people on board? And why did the forest feel so alive around it, like it was guarding a secret? A sudden sound broke the silence, a dull, distant thud. It came from the direction of the ship. The explorer froze, holding their breath. Another sound followed, softer this time, like something shifting inside the metal hull. It could have been the wind. It could have been the ship settling. But it didn't sound like either of those things. It sounded deliberate, like a footstep on metal. The explorer grabbed their flashlight and aimed it toward the ship. The beam cut through the mist, hitting the rusted surface. Nothing moved. The door that had been slightly open was still open, swaying just a little. No figures, no shadows, but the feeling in the air had changed. It was heavier now. The forest seemed to lean in closer. After several minutes, the sound stopped. The explorer let out the breath they'd been holding and lowered the flashlight. Maybe it was just the wind, they told themselves. Maybe the ship made noises like old buildings do at night. But deep down, they knew it hadn't sounded like the wind at all. They returned to the small fire, but sleep didn't come easily. Every crackle of the flames sounded too loud. Every gust of wind felt like a whisper. The giant ship stood in the darkness like a sleeping creature, its rusted skin reflecting bits of firelight. Whatever story it held inside, it wasn't ready to tell it just yet. And the explorer, sitting alone in the cold forest, could only wait for morning to step into that story. When the first light of dawn finally broke through the mist, the explorer was already awake. The forest looked different in the pale light, less threatening, but no less mysterious. The ship's white hull glowed softly in the early sun, its size even more striking in daylight. The explorer packed their bag carefully, checked their flashlight and rope, and took one last deep breath. They were ready. Today, they would climb that ladder, push open that door and find out what waited inside. The morning air was cold and damp, and the forest was covered with a thin mist. The explorer stood in front of the massive cruise ship, staring at it with a mix of excitement and uneasiness. The sunlight was still weak, filtering through the tall trees and casting long shadows across the ground. The vines wrapped around the ship's hull looked darker in the light, like long ropes pulled tight. The air was quiet again, almost too quiet. It was the kind of silence that made every small sound louder. The explorer tightened the straps of their backpack and walked closer to the rusted ladder. It hung loosely from the lower deck, its metal step stained with brown rust, but it still looked strong enough to climb. Each step groaned softly under their weight as they began to go up. The ship loomed larger with every movement, and the forest floor slowly disappeared from view. A soft breeze brushed against their face, carrying the faint scent of old seawater and something else. Something stale, like air that hadn't moved in years. When they reached the first deck, their boots touched metal for the first time. It was cold. A faded welcome mat lay in front of the half-open door, but it was torn and brittle, crumbling slightly under their foot. The door creaked as the wind moved it back and forth like the ship was breathing. For a moment, the explorer just stood there listening. The only sounds were the soft creaks of the ship's metal frame and their own heartbeat. They took out a flashlight from their bag, turned it on, and slowly pushed the door open. It moved with a long, tired groan. The light from outside spilled into a narrow hallway. The walls inside were lined with once white paneling, now stained yellow and brown with age. Dust floated in the air, swirling slowly in the flashlight's beam. The floor was covered with dirt, leaves, and bits of broken glass. The explorer stepped inside carefully, the sound of their boots echoing in the empty hallway. Every step seemed to travel far, bouncing off walls and doors. It felt like the ship was listening. On the left, a row of cabin doors stood half open. On the right, a long window stretched down the corridor, but it was fogged over and cracked, letting in weak slivers of sunlight. It felt like stepping into another world, a place that had been frozen in time. The explorer touched the wall. It was damp and cold. A faded safety sign hung crookedly above one of the doors. It still had words on it, but most of the letters were hard to read. The only thing still clear was a single word: deck. This wasn't a small boat. This was a real cruise ship that once carried hundreds of people. Now it was a silent shell. They moved slowly, pointing the flashlight at the ground. Old cups, shoes, a piece of luggage, and even a sun hat lay scattered in the hallway. It was like people had left in a hurry, leaving everything behind. A soft chill crept up their neck. They couldn't help imagining the passengers walking through these halls, laughing, talking, maybe waving to each other. That same hallway now felt like a ghostly shadow of those moments. The explorer reached the end of the hallway and gently pushed open another door. It led into a large lounge area. Rows of chairs and tables were still arranged neatly, though covered in thick dust. A big chandelier hung above the center of the room, its crystals dull and tangled with cobwebs. A few windows were broken and beams of sunlight streamed through the cracks, making the floating dust look like tiny stars in the air. They walked between the tables, careful not to make too much noise. A half-finished drink sat on one of the tables. The glass had a thin layer of green moss growing inside it. Nearby, a deck of playing cards lay scattered across the floor. It was as if someone had been here one moment and vanished the next. The explorer ran their fingers lightly over the edge of a chair. The wood cracked softly under the touch. Everything here was fragile, like a memory that might disappear if touched too hard. The silence inside the lounge felt heavier than the silence outside. It wasn't just quiet. It felt thick, like the air itself carried the weight of something that had happened long ago. They turned toward the staircase at the far end of the room. The railing was covered in rust, but it still seemed steady. The explorer slowly climbed up, each step making a hollow metallic sound. The second deck was darker. The flashlight's beam was the only thing cutting through the shadows. Here, the hallway was narrower and lined with more cabin doors. Some doors were closed, some slightly open, and a few hung off their hinges. The explorer stopped at one door and pushed it open gently. It revealed a small cabin. 2 narrow beds were still in place with old blankets folded at the end. A suitcase lay on the floor, open but full as if someone never finished packing. A pair of sunglasses rested on a small table next to a cracked mirror. A photograph was pinned to the wall. It showed a group of smiling people standing on the deck of the ship, holding drinks in their hands. Their faces were faded, but their smiles were still visible. For a moment, it felt like the room had its own heartbeat. The explorer stepped back, not wanting to disturb the stillness too much. They continued down the hallway, checking each room carefully. Some were empty. Some still held pieces of lives that had been left behind. A child's toy, a camera, a pair of shoes, a diary with its cover faded and pages stuck together. Everything felt untouched, as if time had simply stopped the moment the ship ended up here. When they reached the end of the hallway, they found a set of double doors with gold handles. They were slightly open, and a cold breeze slipped through the gap. The explorer pushed the doors wider. It led into what must have once been the grand dining hall. The ceiling here was high, with long tables stretching across the room. Dozens of chairs were neatly arranged, and some plates and cutlery were still on the tables, covered in dust. A large clock on the far wall had stopped at a very specific time. It looked like it had been frozen there for years. A soft sound echoed from somewhere deep inside the ship. It wasn't loud, but it was enough to make the explorer stop moving. It was like a door creaking or something metal shifting. The flashlight beam moved slowly across the room, but nothing was there. Just shadows and dust. But the sound had been real. They could feel it in their chest. They took a slow breath and walked to the center of the room. On the floor near one of the tables was a small leather book. The explorer picked it up carefully. The cover was cracked and stiff. Inside, the pages were yellow and brittle, but some writing was still visible. It was a journal. The handwriting was neat but faded. Most of the words were hard to read, but a few sentences stood out clearly. The storm is getting worse. We can't contact anyone. The captain says everything will be fine. But something feels wrong. The explorer closed the book and tucked it gently into their bag. Whatever happened here hadn't just been a simple accident. There had been fear. There had been confusion. And then, nothing. They walked toward a narrow hallway at the back of the dining hall. It led to another staircase going further up. At the top, the air felt even colder. A faint smell of sea salt hung in the air, mixed with old metal and something like burned oil. The explorer reached the upper deck where the control rooms must have been. The bridge door was locked, but the small window on it was broken. Peering inside, they could see the captain's chair still in place, the navigation panels dark and broken. A compass sat on the console, its needle spinning slowly even though there was no wind. The explorer felt a strange chill run through their spine. The forest outside was calm. No movement, no sound. But inside this ship it felt like the air carried old echoes. Not ghosts exactly, but memories that refused to fade. They moved back down the stairs, carefully retracing their steps. The plan wasn't to explore everything in one go. This place was too big, too silent, too strange. It was better to learn its shape first, like learning how to walk through someone else's house at night. The explorer returned to the lounge area on the lower deck, their footsteps soft and steady. As they approached the main door, something caught their eye. A faint mark on the floor near one of the tables. It looked like a footprint, not theirs. It was older, dry but clear. It pointed toward the staircase they hadn't gone down yet, the one leading below deck. The air near the staircase was cooler, almost icy, and a soft dripping sound echoed from below. The explorer's hand tightened on the flashlight. Someone had been here, maybe not recently, but not too long ago either. The idea of not being alone inside this ship sent a sharp shiver down their spine. But there was no turning back now. They had found something extraordinary, something that no one else had seen for decades. As they stepped outside onto the deck to breathe fresh air, the forest seemed calmer. Birds had returned, singing faintly in the distance. The ship looked different now from the outside. It was no longer just a strange structure in the woods. It was a story waiting to be told, one layer at a time. The explorer stood there for a while, feeling the cool breeze on their face. They knew they would have to go below deck next. Whatever secrets the ship held, the answers were probably down there, hidden in the dark where the air smelled like old water and iron. The thought was both terrifying and thrilling. They adjusted the straps of their bag again and looked up at the sky. Tomorrow they would return inside and go deeper. Whatever was waiting down there, they were ready to find it. The next morning, the forest was calm again. A light fog hung low over the ground and the air smelled fresh after the long, quiet night. The explorer stood at the base of the ship, looking up at the dark entrance. The memory of the strange footprints near the staircase had stayed in their mind all night. Whoever or whatever had been inside this place had gone below deck, and that was exactly where they needed to go next. The explorer climbed the ladder once more. The metal groaned softly, but it held firm. The deck felt colder than yesterday, almost like the ship itself had a chill running through it. They turned on the flashlight and stepped through the door again. The hallway was exactly as they had left it. The broken window, the scattered belongings, the thick layer of dust, it all looked untouched. But the silence inside still carried that same weight, like the walls were holding their breath. They walked toward the staircase that led down to the lower deck. The light from the hallway faded quickly as they descended, and the air grew colder with every step. A faint sound of dripping water echoed somewhere below. It wasn't fast or loud, just steady, like water falling slowly from a rusty pipe. The smell changed, too. It was heavier here, a mix of old metal, damp wood, and the faint trace of salt water that had no reason to be in a forest. The staircase ended in a long, narrow corridor. The walls were darker here, streaked with black stains and peeling paint. Some of the ceiling panels were hanging down, and the floor was slick in places where rainwater had probably leaked in over the years. The flashlight beam cut through the darkness, catching dust in the air that looked like tiny stars floating around. The explorers' boots made soft, hollow sounds as they walked. The lower deck had no windows. It felt like stepping into the belly of something enormous and sleeping. On both sides of the hallway were heavy doors with faded signs. Some had numbers, some had labels like storage, a kitchen, and crew quarters. Most of them were closed. A few were slightly open, their darkness blending with the shadows around them. The explorer stopped at the first door and pushed it open gently. Inside was a storage room. Rows of metal shelves lined the walls, covered in dust and cobwebs. Some shelves still held supplies, cans of food, cleaning products, folded linens. Everything was untouched, as if the people who had placed these things here had expected to return. A small calendar hung crookedly on the wall. The year printed on it was decades in the past. That alone made the explorer's chest tighten. How long had this ship been sitting here, hidden in the forest? They stepped out and walked further down the hall. Another door stood slightly open. This one led to a kitchen. The smell here was different, sharper, like old oil and rust. Pots and pans hung from hooks, some still shining faintly under the layer of grime. A row of plates and cups sat on a metal counter. Some cups still had dried stains at the bottom, as if someone had set them down and never came back. A spoon lay on the floor near the sink, half buried in dust. The explorer couldn't help but imagine the sound of people talking and laughing in this place years ago. Now it was nothing but silence and shadows. They moved on. The deeper they went, the colder the air became. At the very end of the corridor stood a door that was different from the others. It was heavier, with a round wheel in the center that had to be turned to open it. The explorer gripped the cold metal and slowly turned it. It groaned loudly, echoing through the corridor. The sound felt like it didn't belong in this silence. When the lock finally gave way, the door opened with a low, heavy creak. Beyond it was a large, dark room. The flashlight beam moved across it slowly. It was the engine room. Giant machines filled the space, towering over the floor. The walls were covered with pipes, some broken, some still intact. Thick cables ran across the ceiling like vines. The explorer stepped inside carefully. The sound of dripping water was louder here, falling from a pipe near the far wall. It echoed off the metal surfaces like a slow clock. The floor was uneven in places, with puddles of water reflecting the light. The explorer's footsteps echoed with a hollow, distant sound. The air smelled strongly of oil and rust, but what caught their attention wasn't the machines. It was something on the wall, a metal plaque covered in dust. The explorer wiped it with the sleeve of their jacket. Faded letters came into view. It was the name of the ship. The name was old and elegant, written in a style that belonged to a different time. The explorer repeated it softly, their voice sounding strange in the empty room. Below the name were numbers and a date. That was the year the ship was launched. The explorer felt a strange weight in their chest. This was real. This wasn't a story or a trick. This ship had once sailed the ocean. A sudden sound broke the stillness, a soft clatter, like something falling in the corner of the engine room. The explorer spun the flashlight toward the noise, heart pounding. But there was nothing there, just the machines and dripping water. Still, the sound had been clear. They took a slow step forward. The beam of light landed on a small object lying on the floor. It was a wrench, old and rusted, but it didn't look like it had just fallen after decades of silence. It was lying too neatly, as if someone had touched it recently. The explorer's breathing grew slower, more careful. They listened. There was no other sound. But the feeling of not being alone grew stronger. The air seemed thicker. Even the dripping water seemed to pause for a heartbeat. The explorer backed out of the engine room, keeping the flashlight aimed forward. Once back in the hallway, they closed the heavy door quietly. Their hands were slightly shaking, not from fear exactly, but from the pressure of the unknown. If someone had been here after all this time, who were they, and where were they now? They continued exploring the lower deck, trying to keep their breathing steady. In one of the side rooms, they found what looked like the captain's office. A large wooden desk sat in the middle of the room. Papers were scattered across it, some yellowed and stuck together, others curling at the edges. A small radio sat on the corner of the desk, covered in dust. It was the kind of radio used to send signals long ago. The explorer brushed their hand lightly over it, feeling the weight of the years. On the wall behind the desk was a large map. The edges were torn, but the lines were still clear. It showed the ship's last recorded route across the ocean. Red ink marked the ship's path. The line stopped suddenly at a point far from any coastline. It didn't make sense. How could a cruise ship vanish from the ocean and end up in a forest? The explorer opened one of the drawers. Inside, they found a logbook. The cover was made of leather, cracked but still firm. They opened it carefully. The handwriting inside was neat, with dates and notes about the voyage. The first few pages were ordinary: weather reports, passenger counts, navigation details. But as they turned the pages, the tone changed. The handwriting grew more rushed. Sentences were shorter. Strange storm approaching. Instruments failing. Lights flickering. No response from base. On the final page, the writing stopped mid-sentence. There was no explanation, no goodbye. Just a line that ended abruptly. The explorer closed the book slowly, feeling the weight of the mystery settle even deeper. Whatever had happened here had been sudden. They left the office and walked further down the hall. At the very end, they found a door that was locked with a chain. It was the only door on the entire lower deck that had been secured like that. The chain was old and rusted, but the lock looked newer, as if someone had returned long after the ship was lost. The explorer ran their hand lightly across the metal. They could feel the cold through their gloves. Their heart beat faster. This door wasn't like the others. It wasn't just part of the past. It belonged to something more recent. Someone had locked it deliberately. They leaned closer and listened. At first there was nothing but silence. But then faintly there was a sound. It was soft, like air moving through a narrow space, or maybe water flowing behind the wall. It wasn't loud, but it was enough to make their breath catch for a second. The explorer didn't try to break the lock. Not yet. It felt like opening this door would change everything. Instead, they stepped back slowly. They wanted to know more before rushing into the unknown. There was already enough proof that this ship had a story far bigger than anyone had imagined. The logbook, the footprints, the wrench on the floor, all of it pointed to something hidden here, something that had been covered up or left behind. As they climbed back up to the main deck, the light from the forest hit their face again. It felt warmer outside, safer. But their thoughts were spinning. How did this ship disappear from the ocean? How did it end up in a forest? Why was the last entry in the logbook unfinished? And most of all, who had been here after all these years? The explorer sat down on the edge of the deck, looking out at the quiet trees. The ship was like a puzzle with pieces scattered everywhere. It didn't feel like just an old wreck anymore. It felt like a place with secrets buried deep inside it, waiting to be uncovered piece by piece. And the locked door below deck was the biggest piece of all. As the sun slowly lowered behind the trees, the explorer made a decision. Tomorrow they would find a way to open that door. Whatever was behind it, they had to see it with their own eyes. Particles that looked like snow. Every step forward echoed softly, making the space feel even more empty. The sound of his boots scraping against the rusted floor made it clear how silent this ship truly was. It felt like time had stopped inside. He walked slowly, breathing carefully, scanning the walls with his light. The corridor stretched like a tunnel with old peeling wallpaper and metal doors on each side. Most of the doors were jammed or sealed shut, but one near the end looked different. There were scratch marks around the handle, as if someone had tried to force it open long ago. His hands shook a little as he reached out. The handle was stiff, covered in layers of grime, but after a few hard twists, the door gave a loud creak. It opened a few inches, then stuck again. He put his shoulder against it, pushed with all his strength, and finally the door swung open with a moan that echoed down the corridor. Inside was a narrow stairwell leading down. Cold air drifted up from below, carrying a faint metallic smell. It was cooler than the rest of the ship and somehow heavier too, like the air itself was warning him not to go further. But he had come too far to turn back now. He adjusted the strap of his backpack and slowly stepped down. The stairs groaned with each step and small rust flakes fell like brown snow. The flashlight flickered for a moment, making his heart race. The lower deck was different. The walls weren't just old. They were reinforced with thick metal plates. The floor was smooth steel instead of rusted wood. It felt more like a secret bunker than a cruise ship. As he walked forward, he noticed strange symbols stenciled on the walls, faded but still visible. They weren't decorations. They looked official, maybe military or scientific. His heart pounded faster as he realized this part of the ship hadn't been built for passengers. It was built for something else entirely. A few meters ahead, he found a large sliding door with a heavy locking mechanism. It looked like the kind you'd find in a vault, not on a vacation ship. Someone had welded extra metal around the edges. It wasn't meant to be opened easily. He ran his fingers along the cold surface, feeling the strange weight of the moment. He turned the rusted wheel in the center of the door. At first it didn't budge. He gritted his teeth and tried again, using both hands this time. Slowly, with a grinding sound, the wheel began to turn. When it finally unlocked, a gust of stale, icy air escaped through the cracks. It smelled like oil and something else he couldn't identify. The door slid open a few inches, and he squeezed his flashlight beam through the gap. The light fell on a large container in the middle of the room. The space inside was huge, like a hidden warehouse beneath the ship. Rows of crates were stacked neatly along the walls. Everything looked untouched, as if it had been sealed up and forgotten for decades. He pulled the door open wider and stepped inside. His boots left clear prints in the thin layer of dust on the floor. The container in the center had thick steel sides and large black letters on it. They were faded, but he could still read part of it. Restricted. His chest tightened. This wasn't just some lost ship with old furniture. This was something else entirely. He walked slowly around the container, brushing off dust to read the smaller markings. It had numbers, codes, and a symbol he didn't recognize. He found a small hatch on the side. It was locked with a thick latch. He knelt down, pulled out a small tool from his bag, and tried to pry it open. After a few tries, the latch broke loose with a sharp snap. The hatch opened with a hiss like air escaping from a long-sealed chamber. Inside, instead of supplies or food, he saw rows of machines stacked carefully in metal racks. They looked too advanced for the time period the ship had disappeared. Thick cables, strange control panels, and something that resembled a generator filled the inside. Some of the surfaces were covered in frost as if they had been frozen in time. He reached out carefully and brushed his fingers over one of the panels. It was cold, unnaturally cold. He noticed a small switch near the base, and though he hesitated, curiosity won. He flipped it gently. A faint hum filled the air, soft but clear. The machine came to life with a weak glow, blinking softly like a heartbeat. He took a step back, holding his breath. How could this still work after all these years? The ship had been lost for decades, buried in a forest far away from the ocean. The hum grew louder for a moment, then leveled out. One of the indicator lights blinked green. The rest of the ship was silent, but down here it felt alive. It was as if the machine had been waiting for someone to find it. He moved to another crate, smaller than the first. The lid was nailed shut, but a few firm hits with a metal rod loosened it. Inside were stacks of folders wrapped in plastic, perfectly preserved. The papers were yellowed but dry. He pulled one out and flipped it open. It was filled with diagrams, calculations, and maps with red markings. He didn't fully understand what he was looking at, but it was clear this wasn't something meant for the public. The dates on the papers went back decades. There were references to field tests, navigation anomalies, and restricted operations. One file had a line that made his stomach drop. Phase 1, relocation test complete. Relocation. The word echoed in his head. Could this explain how a massive cruise ship ended up here in the middle of the forest? He kept searching, pulling more papers out. Some of them mentioned places he recognized, coastal areas where the ship had supposedly disappeared. Others were stamped with official seals, It was clear the ship wasn't just carrying tourists on its last voyage. It was carrying secrets. In the corner of the room, half buried under debris, he spotted a large metal box with a thick cable still attached to the wall. It looked like a control unit of some kind. A small label on the front read, "Do not activate without authorization." His hand hovered over the switch. A part of him wanted to leave it alone, but another part of him, the part that had followed this mystery deep into the forest, wanted answers. He pressed the switch. At first, nothing happened. Then faintly, lights flickered on across the walls. One by one, emergency lights glowed a dull red, casting long shadows across the crates. The hum of machinery returned, louder this time, almost like a heartbeat. He stepped back, trying to steady his breathing. A panel near the box lit up with numbers he didn't recognize. The floor beneath him vibrated slightly, and a distant clank echoed through the hallway. Whatever this technology was, it wasn't completely dead. It was still alive, even after all these years buried in the forest. He turned toward the sliding door, suddenly feeling the weight of what he had uncovered. This wasn't just an old shipwreck. This was a place that had been hidden for a reason. The government files, the advanced machines, the sealed rooms, everything pointed to something much bigger. His mind raced as he tried to piece it together. Maybe this ship hadn't been lost at sea. Maybe it had been moved, relocated somehow. And if that was true, then someone had done it. Someone had wanted this ship to disappear. He heard a soft sound behind him. It was faint, but enough to make his chest tighten. He turned quickly, scanning the room with his flashlight. Nothing moved, but the humming of the machine seemed to grow slightly louder. He decided it was time to leave this room for now. He grabbed a few papers and tucked them carefully into his bag. As he stepped toward the door, he glanced back at the glowing lights. A part of him wanted to keep digging, to find every secret hidden here, but another part of him knew he was walking on dangerous ground. The metal door slid shut behind him with a heavy thud. He leaned against it for a moment, breathing hard. His heart was pounding. Everything he had found was proof that this wasn't just a mystery. It was a buried story with layers no one had told. He started up the stairs slowly, feeling the air grow warmer the higher he climbed. When he reached the corridor again, it felt almost strange to be back in the quiet. But now the silence didn't feel the same. Now he knew what lay beneath it. The ship wasn't just an accident of nature. It was something planned, something hidden, and he had just opened the first door to its secret.